His shoulders shifted and bounced in time with his humming, or at least Elizabeth thought they were his shoulders. As he passed under a bright ray of light, Elizabeth could see that the rat was actually quite slim. What she had mistaken for his shoulders were in fact the corners of a disproportionately large pack slung against his back. He wore a tweed jacket and a vest underneath. A matching flat cap perched on his head. As the rat passed, Elizabeth inched around the left side of the table's leg, keeping herself just out of sight. The humming stopped. It did not simply fade away as if into the distance, but stopped entirely. Elizabeth peered around the side of the wooden pillar. She saw nothing there. It was as if the rat had vanished into thin air. She gulped and ducked back behind the leg. For a moment she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and tried to calm herself. As her heart finally seemed to relax, Elizabeth opened her eyes, and turning to her left found herself face to face with the very rat she had thought she'd escaped. He tipped his cap to her. "Good evening, lass." Elizabeth's first instinct was to bite the rat's nose and run. However, that would only serve to antagonize him, and if he were one of the rats from the alley, as Elizabeth suspected, that was the last thing she wanted to do. At last she answered.
"Hello."
She glanced over her shoulder, and then all around, silently working out escape routes and hiding places in her head. "I beg your pardon, miss, but I say, you look as if you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Elizabeth shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but she could feel her shoulders shaking with every motion.
"Well, you know what they say about books and covers."
"They're for reading, not propping up furniture?"
"What? No."
Elizabeth exclaimed, somewhat shocked.
"You can't judge them by their covers. That's the saying."
The rat paused in thought. "Oh, well then, I guess I'll leave you to it then." Elizabeth sighed in relief.
"Thank you. Good night."
The rat tipped his hat and turned away. He hadn't gone 5 paces, however, when he stopped in his tracks and turned around. "What about car manuals or how-to books?" Elizabeth blinked.
What about them?"
"I would think their covers quite self-explanatory, unless there had been a mistake at the printers and a book got the wrong cover, but that would be rather rare, I might think." The rat shrugged and smiled. "Well, good night, miss, and good luck to you." Once more the rat tipped his hat to Elizabeth and turned away. Elizabeth watched as the rat disappeared around a corner, and then sank to the floor with a relieved sigh. Her relief didn't last long, however, as the moment begged a new question. What now? Yes, she was safe for the moment, but where did that leave Monster and Stew? Elizabeth gulped as she thought about it.
"I should have grabbed the knife when Mickey dropped it,"
she thought.
"I could have driven him off with that. Maybe I could have gotten back in the ring and helped Monster. Maybe I could have—"
She sniffed as her mind drifted into ever darker places.
"Maybe I could have gathered up some of the children. Maybe I could have taken them into the gorge with me, and then Monster might have protected them as well. Maybe—"
"I'm terribly sorry, miss." Elizabeth let out a frightened yelp as the sound of the rat's voice cut off her line of thought. "It's just that, well, I really am a fair judge of character, and—"
"Please don't sneak up on me like that. You could have given me a heart attack."
"I really am sorry," the rat assured her. "It's just that, well, I thought I heard you crying, and I know you said you were fine, but your every motion says otherwise." Elizabeth sighed and looked at the ground.
"Is it really that obvious?"
The rat nodded. "I'm afraid so, lass." Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew she had to ask the question sooner or later.
"You're not one of them, are you?"
"Them who?"
"The rats outside."
"Miss, you'll need to be more specific than that." Elizabeth paused a moment to gather her thoughts.
"I came here with 2 friends. As we entered the alley, a group of rats attacked us.
Ah, the rat nodded, appearing to understand. I expect that would be Mr. Charlie's gang.
The one in charge, at least I think he was in charge, called himself William Dawson, and there was a mouse with him.
A Mr. Lorry? Elizabeth nodded.
Yes, that's him.
The rat nodded. Yes, that would be Charlie's gang. Then he paused, and all the color drained from his face. And your friends, where are they? Elizabeth shook her head.
The last I saw, they were surrounded by rats, forced to fight Dawson, and Mickey was chasing me.
The rat furrowed his brow. I thought I heard some commotion earlier.
I want to go back, but
there's nothing you can do right now, the rat finished. I wouldn't want to show my face in the open if I were you.
So there's nothing I can do.
That's about the shape of it. The rat rubbed his chin in thought. Of course, Charlie's gang is rather fond of me. More specifically, they like my contraptions.
Your what?
Oh, but I haven't properly introduced myself. The rat tipped his hat a third time. Peter Dane, salvager, tinkerer, and inventor extraordinaire. At your service, Miss... Elizabeth hesitated. The rat seemed harmless enough, and yet...
I'm sorry, Mr. Dane, but the last time I gave someone my name, it didn't turn out so well.
Well, I suppose I can understand that. Forgive me for not bowing, but as you can see... Peter adjusted his pack for emphasis. I'm rather full up. No telling what might fall out if I bend over. At this, Peter stepped away, motioning for Elizabeth to follow. Well, come along, lass.
Where are we going?
Somewhere Mr. Lorry won't find you, Peter explained. Some place far out of his reach.
What about my friends?
Once you're safe, I'll have a look around. No one will care if they see me. I might even be able to ask a few questions. Peter stopped a moment and turned back once more. Speaking of which, who am I looking for?
A mouse and a shrew,
Elizabeth answered.
a very large, bald mouse. His name is...
Elizabeth paused. She felt the same hesitation as when Peter had asked her name, but after a moment's thought she realized it couldn't be avoided.
Jeremiah. Jeremiah Marsh, but he prefers to be called Monster. And the shrew is, well, he's Stu, the shrew. Stu the shrew. And...
She took a deep breath, knowing she may as well go all the way now.
I'm Elizabeth Hartley.
Peter's face brightened considerably. Elizabeth, just like Her Majesty the Queen. With that, Peter turned away once more and led off around the corner, Elizabeth close at his heels. From there, the unlikely duo proceeded to a towering display of boxes, piled into a very high, very cold space in the back of the chamber. He made a left, leading down along the far end of the structure. As the two made their way ever further, the air grew colder. Elizabeth pulled her cloak tight about her shoulders for warmth. Peter finally stopped near a towering glass wall at the far end of the display and shrugged his immense pack from his shoulders. Elizabeth gave a skeptical look around. They were in a very open area. Cover was minimal. Though it may have been an isolated part of the chamber, anyone who passed by would easily spot them.
This is your hiding place?
Peter shook his head, grinning just the slightest bit smugly as he rifled through his pack. Hardly, though I must say nobody would expect you to hide here. He withdrew a metal tripod, walked to the far corner, and then cautiously stepped away, moving parallel to the metal structure. And 50 paces. He then stepped carefully away from the structure, making sure to count each pace this way as well. And this should be the spot. At this, he set up the tripod directly over his final step, and returned to his pack. Elizabeth squinted, her mouth hanging open in confusion.
What on earth are you doing?
Measuring, was the answer. I know the proper distance, angle, and trajectory. Now it's just a matter of measuring them out. Nothing that came out of the rat's mouth made any sense to Elizabeth. All she could do was watch and wait. Next, Peter retrieved an odd little metal box, which he attached to the tripod via a curious little vise, which he spent a long time adjusting. He then crouched behind the tripod, peering up at the far end of the box and beyond, as if checking his work. Apparently satisfied, he braced his foot against the rear legs and pulled a lever on the side of the box. There was a loud boing, and a white glove flew out of the box, propelled by the longest spring Elizabeth, or you or I for that matter, had ever seen. It flashed in a spectacular arc up into the air, sailing to the very edge of the display, where some internal mechanism must have triggered, and the fingers closed tightly about the narrow metal ledge. Peter gave the spring a few sharp tugs, testing the glove's grip. Apparently satisfied, he turned to Elizabeth and announced, "That's that, then. Up you go now." Elizabeth eyed the makeshift ladder skeptically.
"Are you sure about this?"
"Quite sure. I've used it many times before, and it always supported my weight. You should have no problem. Just don't look down." Elizabeth gulped as she looked up and up and up.
"Well,"
she told herself,
"at least it's nothing compared to the gorge."
Yet even as she thought it, she realized she no longer had Dawn holding on to her, and there was nothing around her waist. If she should slip and fall...
"Just don't look down." "Okay."
The spring quivered under Elizabeth's weight as she stepped on the lowest rung. Taking a deep breath, she brought up her second foot. The spring swung unsteadily to the side, leaving Elizabeth to hang by her fingers as her feet flew out from beneath her. "You're doing very well," Peter called after her.
Very well indeed,
Elizabeth thought.
We'll see how I'm doing when I get more than an inch off the ground.
Despite her misgivings, Elizabeth, well, she did very well, to quote our inventive friend. Her heart pounded brutally against her ribs all the way up, but she did indeed reach the top and climb over the side. What a sight it was that met Elizabeth as she crawled over the edge. Grand blocks of cheese, piled as high and as far in either direction as she dared to look. Her knees went weak. Her head went light. Elizabeth tightly shut her mouth as she felt it start to water. She felt as if she had died and gone to mouse heaven. "Now then," Peter remarked as he joined Elizabeth at the top, "if you'll come this way, please." Elizabeth had to force herself to concentrate, to see where Peter was going, and to look away from the cheese. "I often come here to dine," Peter explained, as he led towards the back end of the structure. "The key is to find a spot where the great apes don't often reach. A block of cheese can last a good day or two there, unnoticed. Of course, to keep this opportunity open, you have to be sure to leave no trace of your passing. So I stash my leftovers right about here." Peter clambered over a block of cheese, making his way to a higher shelf, and slipped between two blocks, disappearing further back. Elizabeth struggled to follow, being considerably smaller than the rat, but still managed. The intoxicating smell of cheese flooded her nostrils as she squeezed further back. Eventually, the golden blocks parted, revealing a tiny hidden chamber in the most remote corner of the structure. A partially eaten block of cheese was tightly wrapped and shoved in the back, out of sight and quite out of reach of a great ape's giant hands. The curious space did not appear to have been planned. "Now, wait here," Peter whispered. "I'll be back soon, I promise." Elizabeth nodded. She might have thanked Peter if it weren't for one thing. He was still a rat, and this was still a very large city, and Elizabeth had no way of knowing the truth of his motives. Yes, Peter could have been helping her out of the goodness of his heart, or it could have been some grand deception, a con job to play opposing pawns against each other. Or maybe he was part of Charlie's gang, as Peter had called it. Judging by her experiences so far, Elizabeth suspected one of the latter options. Outside Elizabeth's hiding place, Peter clambered down to the floor and, pressing a button inside his little box, disengaged the hand mechanism anchoring the spring in place. The makeshift ladder clattered to the floor. Peter carefully packed it away, winding it up with a crank on the side of the box, and then latching its lid closed, sealing away the glove for another use, and slipping it back into his pack. The tripod followed shortly after. Now Elizabeth really was on her own. There was no way for her to climb down save to wait for Peter's return. She curled up in the far corner, just behind the cheese, and pulled her cloak tight about her for warmth. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. In that dark hiding place, Elizabeth found her gaze drifting to the cheese beside her. Elizabeth's stomach growled, roared even, as the smell of the cheese threatened to smother her. She forced herself to look away, only for her gaze to drift back again. Away her eyes flicked, back they slowly drifted, away and back, like the pendulum of a grandfather clock, in perfect rhythm with the passing seconds. Elizabeth closed her eyes.
This isn't the time. It's not the time.
Yet her hunger gnawed at the pit of her stomach. Food was so near, so tantalizingly near, and it smelled wonderful, like a bit of home had tracked her out to the city and was now calling her name. It might easily have been one of Dawn's gifts, presented with a sly wink and a flirty jest at Elizabeth's expense. There might have been a shelf of books beside her, and a warm blanket across her lap as she read the adventures of others, instead of living them herself. Elizabeth sat up with a sharp sigh.
Fine, fine. One nibble, that's all.
She paused a moment as she realized she was only talking to herself.
I hope Peter finds them soon. I'm starting to sound like Monster.
Elizabeth rubbed her hands together for warmth and unfolded the crumpled plastic wrapping to get at the hunk of cheese inside. She broke off a tiny corner and ate it. The sense of relief was immense, and drew an incredible sigh of satisfaction from Elizabeth. Somewhere, deep in the back of her head, something snapped. Elizabeth's eyes crossed, and she felt her mouth bending into a dazed grin. And that, as they say, was that. Out in the alley, Peter found himself confronted with a far less appetizing sight. Just where Elizabeth had said there was, Peter came across the telltale signs of a savage fight. There was a very fresh, very red smear on the ground, streaking in circles, accompanied by foot and hand prints scuffed along the ground, and licking them only confirmed his suspicions. A harsh, coppery taste met Peter's tongue. He was indeed looking at blood. Looking up, he found no rats on the fire escape. The alley was quite abandoned. Empty plastic bags drifted by, blown in the wind like lacy tumbleweeds. Whatever had happened here was very much concluded. There were no drag marks. Whoever lost the fight must have been left for dead. Peter rubbed his chin in thought. This left 3 possibilities. 1, Elizabeth's friends lost the fight but survived and crawled into some sheltered place to recover, or die. 2, they had been left for dead and were then eaten by a passing cat. 3, they won the fight, and who knew where they were now? The sounds of movements in a nearby trash can caught Peter's attention. "Hello!" he called out. "Who's this now?" The sounds abruptly ended. Slowly, cautiously, a little face peered out, over the side of the can, one eye spinning erratically about, the other shining a beautiful indigo. Peter immediately recognized the distinctive face of Michael Lorry. "My word, what happened to you?" "Bilge was in a rotten mood." "Well, I can see that. What happened?" Mickey flashed a crooked grin.
"We met a beautiful lady, and a very unfriendly behemoth with an axe."
Mickey shrugged, his grin fading.
"Bilge got in a fight, and I tried to get the lady alone. I didn't see much else."
"Did you see where everyone went?"
No, but if you want Bilge, he went to Mr. Biggs.
With that, Mickey went back to rifling through the trash, mumbling faintly to himself. Peter mused. If Mr. Dawson was in such a rotten mood, something must have gone terribly wrong for him. This fight, perhaps. Mr. Biggs was the name given to a rat-sized bar which had been built onto the side of a great ape structure. It was, in fact, the brainchild of none other than Peter Dane, for none of the other rats possessed the know-how of designing or carrying out great ape quality construction. To a great ape, the bar was no more than an odd protrusion from the side of the building, a simple quirk of great ape design. It was but one of many projects that Peter had carried out for the big cheese, but it was the first and the most popular, and it had long since helped to endear him to Mr. Big. That was Peter's next destination. A metal logo, the letters in the name Mr. Biggs shaped into the form of a rat's head, wearing a fedora and smoking a cigar, marked the narrow entrance. Just an insignificant crack to the great apes, but a fair-sized doorway to a rat. Peter set down his pack, tucking it safely away under the cover of a discarded newspaper, and fitted a curious device to his right forearm. Several straps fastened 2 metal chambers to the back of his arm, a trigger on either side hooking under his index and middle fingers. Each chamber was fitted with a crank on one side or the other. These were used for reloading once the chambers had been discharged. Armed and ready, Peter slipped his jacket sleeve over the device and ducked into the bar, where he intended to question one William Dawson. This was not a place Peter frequented. When he designed Mr. Biggs, Peter had done so as a peace offering, so that the big cheese and his gangs would leave him alone. As he peered through the haze of cigar smoke, he felt extremely out of place. A bar and stools ran along the wall to Peter's right, and round tables were set out to the left, seating a roster of patrons that included both rats and mice. A rat-sized piano was set against the far wall, in the shadow of a small stage, populated with dancing ladies of both the rat and mouse variety. Behind the bar sat a can of beer, just a serving to a great ape, but it may as well have been a full-sized barrel to a rat, with a functioning spigot driven into its side. 2 rats in particular stood out to Peter. In a shady corner, dressed in a pinstriped jacket and a white button-down shirt, sat one Charles Vincetti, more commonly known on the streets as Chubby Charlie. He ran the block, but only as long as the big cheese said so. The other rat to stand out was seated at the bar, bent over a drink. The skull and crossbones on his sleeveless jacket gave him away. Peter tried to take a deep breath before confronting the rat, but the heavy smoke in the air left him coughing and gasping. At last he gave up on the exercise and just sat down beside Dawson. Bill was less than welcoming.
There's other stools besides that one. Now give me some bloody space.
Peter eagerly obliged, moving several seats away.
That's better. Now, what do you want?
I heard there was a bit of a scuffle earlier.
If you mean a fight, aye, there was. What's it to you?
Just a passing curiosity.
Really? A passing curiosity that brought you out of your bleeding hole and into this dump?
I'm a very curious person.
Too bloody curious for your own good.
I talked to Mickey outside. He said he didn't see much.
Aye, and he won't be seeing much for a good long while.
So, what happened? Bill growled and emptied his glass.
What happened? I'll show you what bloody happened.
He swiveled about on his stool, whipping out a steel hook just inches from Peter's eyes.
A bleeding mouse took my hand, is what happened, and if I ever see him again, I'll give him a left hook he'll never forget.
Peter gulped and forced the friendliest, most unantagonistic smile he could manage.
I don't suppose you saw where he went? Ah, Bill spat. Of course I did. I wasn't just laying there, holding my bleeding stump of an arm while he got away. Oh no, I was watching his every bloody move.
Could you
Tell me where he went then. Bill abruptly stood up. And who wants to know, eh?
Just a friend, Peter squeaked.
And what friend would that be, eh?
Bill snarled.
You don't have any bloody friends, Pete, unless you made a new one tonight, eh? Pretty little friend with a red cape.
The hook carved a narrow path in the bar as Bill dragged it forward. Peter hopped backwards onto the stool behind him.
Well, now that you mention it, I suppose she was rather attractive, in a mousy sort of way.
Uh-huh, Bill sneered.
I was thinking so. Well, you just tell her to get as far from here as she can, for the good of her health, eh? City smog's not good for a lady.
Peter nodded emphatically. Of course.
And Pete, if you have made a pretty little friend tonight, you might want to make a trip to the country too, 'cause I'll be watching you. Understand?
Yes, very much so.
Then beat it, Pete, or I'll bury you under your own bloody pub.
Peter grinned nervously, tipped his hat, and darted out the door. Outside, he retrieved his pack and dashed off down the alley, heart pounding. Bill, however, was in a considerably calmer state of mind as he emerged. He gave a harsh rap against the side of a nearby trash can, prompting a surprised yelp from inside. A moment later, Mickey's crooked face peered down over the side.
Yes, Bilge? Follow that rat. Yes, Bilge. And don't call me Bilge.
Mickey cackled as he dashed off after Peter.
I love it when I make him angry.
Peter ducked behind a cardboard box and heaved a loud, rib-shaking cough. Leftover smoke gushed from his throat as the thick bar air left him, and he could feel his mind clear immediately as the moderately fresher open air flooded his lungs. Peter peered around the side, checking for signs of pursuit. Little did he realize that, at that moment, Mickey was hiding on the other side of the box, listening intently for signs of movement, and something else entirely was perched on top of the box, observing the other two, who mistakenly thought themselves hidden. Seeing nothing, and hearing only the faint sounds of distant engines and wailing sirens, Peter continued on his way, at a much slower, calmer pace. Unbeknownst to him, two shadows trailed behind, one on a low path following in Peter's footsteps, the other leaping along the tops of boxes and garbage cans. A loud crash of feet striking a trash can lid alerted both Peter and Mickey to the presence of the second pursuer. Mickey ducked behind the cover of a garbage can, just in case Peter should look behind him. Peter, however, was gazing straight up at this time, and he caught sight of something large. Not as large as a rat, but he could tell it was no rat at a glance. Its shape and posture were wrong. Whatever it was, however, it was quite unnatural. Peter broke into a full run, sprinting away with all the speed he could muster. Mickey emerged from cover to pursue, only to be brought up short when the thing on the trash can leapt down, landing on Mickey's tail and pinning him in place. A quick hop aside, followed by a harsh downward swipe of the flat side of a halberd, flung the much smaller mouse against the side of a trash can. Despite the night's prior abuse, Mickey was, remarkably, still able to stagger back to his feet. However, he was not going to be running again until his head cleared. Now it was down to Peter and the thing with the halberd. It was hairless, pale, and so covered in scabs and bruises it barely looked like a mouse. Visions swept through Peter's mind of Quasimodo, Frankenstein's monster, Mr. Hyde, the mummy, and monsters, he whispered, suddenly making a connection. I wonder. Peter felt the triggers against his fingers. Yes, he was still armed. He whirled about, took aim, and pulled the first trigger. Boing! Propelled by a long, powerful spring, a boxing glove shot from the first chamber, catching Peter's unsuspecting pursuer square in the face. The mutant mouse stumbled and tumbled onto his side. Peter hastily wound the crank on the first chamber, retracting the boxing glove and reloading his meager weapon. "Mr. Jeremiah Marsh, I presume?" If it wasn't, Peter thought, he had best be ready to fire again and run.
"Jeremiah is dead and buried,"
the mutant mouse mumbled, shaking his head in a daze.
"I am Monster."
"Terribly sorry, old boy," Peter spoke quickly, knowing that if he didn't, he might not get a chance to say another word. "I've been looking for you. Couldn't afford to ask directly, you know. There's always someone listening in." Monster, oblivious to Peter's words, climbed to his feet, propping himself up on his halberd, and pressed a hand against his throbbing forehead.
"I am Monster."
"Yes, I had gathered that," Peter added. "Elizabeth sent me to find you. Elizabeth Hartley."
"Elizabeth?"
Monster's ears perked up. He bared his teeth.
"Elizabeth? Where is she? What have you done? Tell me!"
Peter pulled the second trigger. Another boxing glove flew out and knocked Monster flat. "She's quite safe, I assure you. I found a place for her to hide until I found you. You aren't going to hurt me, are you?" Monster growled as he shook his head again, unable to help but notice the stars were no longer just in the sky. Peter took a step back and furiously began cranking the second chamber. "I'm hoping that you know. I really do hope that you know." Monster's eyes flashed with anger, but as he regained his feet, he kept his distance. Peter heaved a sigh and lowered his arm. "Well, I can certainly see why they call you Monster. I do believe Mr. Boris Karloff would be proud."
"Where's Elizabeth?"
"Ah, yes, Elizabeth. She's safe. I found a place for her to hide while I looked for you." Peter paused, glancing around the alley. "And, what of Stu the Shrew?"
"Take me to her."
"Oh, yes, of course. But I do need to find this Stu, you see."
"Show me I can trust you, rat. Then I'll take you to the shrew."
Peter nodded. "Yes, of course. I understand perfectly." Turning around, Peter led off down the alley, motioning for Monster to follow. "Come along now, sir." A few minutes later, Peter and Monster were emerging from a little hole in the wall of a vast chamber, a store of food for the great apes. Monster wrinkled his nose as the alien smells of the place reached him. Unnatural, sterile smells of plastic and disinfectant, mixed with the organic, sickly sweet aroma of fruit and the earthy, grassy scent of vegetables. A soft hum, similar to the ice machine, but far quieter, made his ears twitch. It all set his nerves on edge. "This way, good sir." Peter's voice brought Monster back to the moment. With a low growl, he followed the rat. By the time Monster arrived at the furthest corner, his patience had reached its limit. He looked around, seeing giant glass walls and feeling the chill in the air, but he saw no sign of Elizabeth. All he saw was Peter, unloading some device from his pack. Monster furrowed his brow and shifted his weight to the right, ready to dodge if another boxing glove should come flying his way.
"Well, rat, where is she?"
Peter said nothing, but pointed straight up.
"Is this some kind of joke?"
Out came the tripod. "It's no joke, my friend. We'll need special equipment to reach Good Bess. Equipment like this." There was a loud boing as Peter launched his distinctive grappling device and anchored the spring stair in place. Monster eyed the conveyance with great suspicion.
"A hand on a spring? It looks like a joke to me."
Peter grunted. "Well, if you like, I could go first, but I assure you it is quite stable." Monster lowered the halberd, blocking Peter's path with a low growl. "I would suggest you leave your weapon here. I can't guarantee the spring will support its weight." Monster ignored the warning and took hold of the first rung. Yet as he set foot in the spiraling ladder, it sagged down to the floor. A second and third step yielded much the same results. At last Monster gave in and dropped his halberd on the ground. He immediately regretted doing so. Without the weight of the halberd holding the spring down, it snapped violently back into position, launching Monster high into the air with a terrified roar. Not unlike a bungee cord, it bounced about a good many times, while the terrified mouse hung on for dear life. Peter just smiled pleasantly through it all.
I'm terribly sorry, good sir, but I did try to warn you.
Monster shook his head and staggered away from the spring, eventually slouching against the side of the refrigerated structure.
Take a breather, friend, Peter suggested. We really only need one person to go up and let Bess know we're here.
Monster nodded gratefully as his head spun. In an instant, Peter was on his way up, nimbly scaling a path he had been up many times before. Yet the moment Peter clambered up over the side, there came a wail of abject horror as he beheld the scene awaiting him. An empty plastic wrapper floated down past Peter, settling at the base of the display, alongside a number of others just like it. Further up, Elizabeth reclined, as if in a lounge chair, against a half-eaten block of cheese, eyes half-closed in a binge-fueled daze, hands clasped across her huge, distended belly. Peter slapped his forehead. "Oh, I say." He shook his head and tapped Elizabeth on the shoulder. She opened one eye, slowly looked up at Peter, and her face turned a bright red.
Oops.
Peter set his hands on his hips. "Really? Is that all you can say?"
Sorry?
Peter glared at her for a time. It was not nearly as harsh or cold as Elizabeth's famous glare, but in a strange way that made it far more cutting. "I found your friend, Mr. Marsh. He's waiting for us. He knows where to find your other friend. Now, we had best be on our way. You don't want the big cheese to know this was your work." With that, he turned away and tested his spring a final time. "It should support your weight. Now come along." Monster's mouth dropped open in sheer amazement as he watched Elizabeth slide down the spring. Not climb, but slide, in a slow spiraling motion that made the spring sway from side to side with her every movement. As she finally landed, both Elizabeth and Monster blurted out the same question in unison.
What happened to you?
What happened to you? Where's Stu? Is he all right?
Stu is safe, Monster assured her. He's hidden in a place called Mr. Biggs. That's how I found your rat friend. Stu overheard a conversation about us. Someone very similar to you was mentioned. So Stu told me what he'd heard, and I followed the rat.
How did you escape the rats?
Elizabeth asked.
The last I saw, you were surrounded, and Dawson...
Paid dearly for his error,
Monster finished. He glared at his halberd with a newfound hatred. Its blade now shone with a faintly ruddy sheen. Elizabeth covered her mouth in horror.
You didn't!
No, Elizabeth Hartley, I did not.
Monster's brow furrowed as he looked away, as if in shame.
But I did cripple him.
Looking back at Elizabeth, Monster went on.
It was enough to scare away the other rats. With each stroke of my blade, they leapt away for fear of their lives. No more blood needed to be shed.
For a moment, Monster closed his eyes and hung his head. Then, very faintly, a light smirk tugged at his mouth. Somewhat playfully, he poked Elizabeth's stomach.
I assume there's a story behind this?
Elizabeth grinned sheepishly.
Well, I was hungry.
Hungry, you say?
Very, very, very hungry. And surrounded with cheese. And all I had to do was wait. And, eat.
Indeed, and now every rat on the block shall pay for it, Peter announced as he hit the floor. He hastily proceeded to begin packing away his device.
It's only a matter of time before the great apes learn of our activities tonight. When they do, they will take steps to prevent the return of any rat in the city, and this place will become a death trap. Hauling his pack onto his shoulders, he concluded, "We can't afford to linger. We must be off as soon as possible." With that, Peter dashed away, without a backward glance. Monster and Elizabeth looked at each other for just a moment. Then Elizabeth took off, as quickly as she could stagger, after Peter. Monster followed, tentatively, mostly out of curiosity.
"Wait for us!"
Elizabeth called after the rat. "Whatever on earth for?" Peter answered her. Strangely enough, he sounded genuinely curious. "You've found one of your friends, and he can lead you to the other. Then the three of you are free to leave this dreary city behind. You've no more need of me."
"But what about you? If I've caused you some kind of trouble—"
Peter stopped short in his tracks. "Some kind of trouble? My dear lady!" Peter's mouth quivered. He looked for a moment as if he might burst into tears. Then he took a deep breath, silently counted to 10, and patted his chest as he exhaled. "I haven't seen you before. Judging by your lack of, He hesitated, searching for the proper word. "I assume you're not from around here? Likely very far from the city, is that correct?"
"I used to live in an empty can in the woods,"
Elizabeth answered. Peter nodded, and closed his eyes for a moment. "Well, here in the city, you see, I live in a very complex ecosystem. That's part of living in the shadow of great apes, you see. In these tight quarters, you understand, rats and mice alike have had to learn to coexist. You live right alongside one another."
"I understand."
Elizabeth nodded. Yes. Well, you see, with so many of us so close together, certain hierarchies develop. One rat is beneath another, who is in turn beneath another. The rat at the top of the social totem pole, as it were, is who we call—"
"The big cheese,"
Elizabeth finished. "Yes, quite. And at the top of such a large hierarchy, you understand, he fights a constant battle to maintain order, and of course to stay at the top. There are many other big cheeses, so to speak, who would very much like to take his place. So of course he has developed a certain ruthlessness, shall we say. He is as much a victim of it all as I am." Peter paused for breath. "Now, I was an outsider. I won my peace with my inventions. I devised ways to get into this place, to raid the great ape's stores of food. I offered my contraptions and training to use them as a peace offering. I am the only other rat who can reach the foodstuffs here." Elizabeth's mouth dropped open in horror as it dawned on her.
"And tonight I put your head on the chopping block."
Somewhere not far away there came a vicious giggle and a sound of tiny, scurrying feet. The color drained from Peter's face. "Oh, dear me!" Looking back to Elizabeth, he spoke a final word of warning. "I know that laugh. He won't hesitate to see us all hang, or sleep with the fishes, or whatever it is these mobster types do. Now run, both of you. Run for all you're worth. Run as if the devil himself were chasing you." Without another word, Peter broke into a full run, the like of which Elizabeth had never seen before. Elizabeth tried to follow him, of course, but between Peter's larger size and the weight of her belly slowing her down, Elizabeth slowly trailed further and further behind the rat. She struggled to keep him in sight as they made for the hole behind the vegetable display. She fought to clamber over the wires and supports between the inner and outer walls. As she emerged into the alley, Elizabeth just barely caught the sight of a hairless, scaled tail vanishing around the corner and into the street beyond.
"I'm going after him,"
Elizabeth stated. Monster would have argued the point. They were in a prime position to make their escape. But he saw that look of determination in Elizabeth's eyes, one which Monster had long since grown accustomed to. "You feel responsible for Peter Dane?"
He did nothing but help us. He never asked for anything in return. And look what I've done to him."
Monster grunted.
"Then we'll meet you back here."
With that, the two mice set off in opposite directions. Elizabeth dashed across the alley and crept to the corner where it opened out into a short driveway, stretching across a sidewalk. A handful of great apes were out and about, moving mountains, their giant boots crunching everything in their path underfoot. Heavy, craggy features flashed in and out of the streetlights as each individual passed under them, their unwieldy, tree-like limbs carrying them rapidly forward with every titanic stride. Peter could not have gone far without being spotted. Elizabeth jumped, with a squeak of fright, as just behind her, the entire alley shifted. A great ape, as big as a hill, had been seated there, so still and so large that he appeared to be no more than a part of the landscape. He raised a house-sized glass bottle to his lips and swallowed a tub's worth of whiskey in a single gulp. Elizabeth froze. The glass bottle came crashing down to the ground just inches away from her. Not far for a great ape, but the size of a small room for a mouse. Shards of glass flew in all directions as the bottle shattered. Elizabeth sheltered behind her cloak as best she could. Then the great ape was still, returning to the landscape of which he was a part. He either didn't notice Elizabeth, or did notice, but simply didn't care. Either way, she sighed in relief. A shadow passed across the light in the street as two great apes met. Their voices rumbled overhead like distant thunder. For a time there was enough cover for Elizabeth to emerge unseen. She took her chance and ventured out into the sidewalk beyond. As she looked about, Elizabeth found no sign of Peter. He must have been caught, crushed, or have vanished into a hole somewhere. Yet as Elizabeth gazed ahead, she saw no obvious openings in the brickwork to her right, which meant if there was an opening, it had to be hidden. Still she crept forward, very much aware of the giants towering overhead. If she could find this opening, assuming there was an opening, then so could the rats. Elizabeth therefore had to find it first. The entrance appeared in the form of a subtle change in texture along the brickwork. The pattern was identical down to the last speck of dirt, but it was unusually flat and had a faint shimmer about it like silk. Barely visible in the dim light was a loop of thread hanging alongside the facade, allowing the wood-framed patch of silk to be drawn aside. Immediately behind, a steep, rat-sized stairway led down, and a light shone far below. Elizabeth slipped inside, just in time to avoid getting crushed under a gigantic boot. She pulled the door closed behind her. Having already made one costly mistake that night, Elizabeth wasn't about to make another. From down below, Elizabeth heard a voice humming a low tune, the same one Peter had been humming when she first saw him. Now, however, what had once been light and jaunty had become slow, even mournful. As quiet and as lightly as she could manage, Elizabeth descended the stairs, the light at the bottom slowly growing closer and brighter as she went. The air was dry and dusty. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and stretched across the walls overhead. The stairway looked as if it hadn't been used in a very long time, which, Elizabeth reasoned, was probably intentional.
"Peter?
Elizabeth called ahead. The humming stopped.
Peter Dane?"
Elizabeth let out a yelp of surprise as she slipped on an especially dusty step and skidded down the stairs before coming to a sudden stop at the bottom, and there landed on her back. Elizabeth was still for a time, breathing heavily. The pain throbbed, eventually giving way to a steady, aching soreness that spread throughout her entire body. Elizabeth struggled to sit up, propping herself up on her elbows. That was when the spider appeared. It was considerably smaller than the tarantulas of the gorge, but was no less hairy, nor was its fanged, many-eyed face any less unsettling. Two huge, black eyes stared from the forefront of its face, a pair of fangs tucked just underneath as it crawled along the ceiling, It lightly dropped down, steadying itself with a line of webbing, and landed right on top of Elizabeth's stomach, those two eyes staring straight down Elizabeth's. Elizabeth screamed. Yarp! The spider leapt backwards and quickly scuttled into hiding under a nearby cloth. A moment later, Peter rose from around a corner as if he were just standing up. Base?
Spider!
Elizabeth shouted, pointing to the pile of blankets. What are you? Peter paused and glanced to where Elizabeth was pointing. What, you mean Matrix?
That thing has a name?
Peter raised a curious eyebrow. Why, yes. Matrix has been my friend and partner for ages. I used his silk to cover up the entrance. Peter lifted the top blanket, revealing the creature hidden underneath, and stroked the spider's abdomen, drawing a peaceful purr from Matrix. Looking back to Elizabeth, Peter asked, Are you mad? The big cheese's men will be here any moment. They may even have followed you here. Elizabeth gulped.
I'm sorry. I couldn't just leave you. Not after everything you've done for me, and everything I've done to you.
Peter sighed and shook his head. He held out a hand and helped Elizabeth to her feet. Well, thank you, I suppose. He turned away and collapsed into a swiveling chair nearby, face in his hands. Come in, Bess. Make yourself comfortable. We're in this together now. Elizabeth ventured further into the chamber. It was a cozy little place, despite the spider webs and the spider watching her as she passed. Peter sat at a large wooden desk, or possibly a work table, which stretched the length of the right-hand wall, coming to an end by the bottom of the stairs. A small curtain hung from a rod in front of a small linen closet, where Matrix now hid. It was just an indent in the wall, with a few shelves installed, but it served its purpose well enough. Against the left-hand wall there sat an old yellow sofa, which sagged with age and use. An oil lamp sitting on the work table provided light in the space, casting shadows against the walls as it glinted off the sides of all manner of strange devices on the table.
This place is amazing,
Elizabeth breathed. Peter gave a rueful half-smile. Yes, it is. He lowered a hand, glancing out from behind his fingers at Elizabeth. This place was my workshop. I put my heart, my very soul into it, into the project here. It was everything to me. I had to come back just one last time, if only to say goodbye. Elizabeth's heart ached as she listened. As Peter's voice trailed off, she could only manage a faint whisper.
I'm so sorry.
Peter shook his head. Well, there's nothing to be done now. Still, I'm grateful I don't have to face it alone.
You could come with us,
Elizabeth blurted out. I could... What?
There's safety in numbers. We could protect you, get you out of town.
Peter shook his head. No, I doubt we could escape the city before the big cheese, or some of his men, caught up with us. Not that it matters. I expect they'll be here any moment. Elizabeth furrowed her brow in thought. She was, quite frankly, not convinced. Creeping to the bottom of the stairway, she lifted a cautious ear and listened.
Peter, do you hear that?
Peter was silent for a time, as he, too, raised an ear. Even Matrix, despite having neither ears nor hands, raised a limb alongside his head, as if cupping a hand to an ear. Eventually, Peter shook his head. I hear nothing.
Exactly. Your hole is very cleverly hidden. The rats may have gone past it without noticing anything. Or maybe it took Mickey a while to reach them. Maybe Monster even ran him down and stopped him from informing the others, or at least delayed him.
A confident smile crossed Elizabeth's face. She leaned an elbow on the work table and bent closer to Peter.
We may have a window of opportunity you never considered.
Peter mumbled. His expression, however, was pained as he looked around his workshop. Whether he lived or died, he would never see it again. At last he hopped to his feet and began rifling through drawers and boxes.
Well, are you coming?
In a moment, in a moment. Matrix crawled out from under his blanket with a curious chirp. Peter slung a number of rolled-up papers over his shoulder. I won't leave without my designs. I have many unfinished projects. Perhaps, if the chance arises, I might complete them on the road. With that, he tucked them into a side pocket in his pack and hauled it over his shoulders. He took a long, final look around the chamber, and then turned back to Elizabeth. Thank you, Bess.
For what? Chasing you out of your home?
For helping me up again afterwards. Peter glanced over his shoulder and gave a sharp whistle. Come, Matrix. Matrix gave an excited yip and scuttled up Peter's pack, eventually taking a perch at the top of it, peering over the top of Peter's cap. Elizabeth's heart leapt for joy as she watched Peter begin his ascent up the stairs. Despite her considerable weight, she found a new spring in her step as she scampered after him. Unfortunately, well, you know what they say about the best-laid plans of mice and men. Peter came to a sudden stop, dead in his tracks, as he approached the top of the stairs. Elizabeth, slowed as she was, managed to halt in nearly perfect time. Just beyond the silk facade of brickwork, there was a shadow, silhouetted against the light of the street lamps outside, of a tall, gangly rat, his left hand ending in a very familiar hook. Evening, Gov. The greeting dripped venomously with false courtesy. Quick, Peter whispered. Go back down. What, aren't you going to invite us in? Bill's voice floated after them. Bloody impolite, leaving guests on your doorstep. Somewhere high above there was a sound of silk ripping. You don't mind if we let ourselves in, do you?
Trapped. You were right, Peter. I'm so sorry.
Peter, however, had a glint in his eye. He was, after all, a rat of many tricks. He dropped his pack unceremoniously on the floor. Matrix, in a panic, scuttled onto Peter's shoulder, just barely maintaining his footing. With a great heave of his shoulders, Peter shoved his sofa aside, revealing a hole in the wall behind.
A secret exit?
Elizabeth asked. Peter shook his head. Storage space. I keep a great many more contraptions on hand than the ones you've seen.
Brilliant. We hide, they find nothing, and...
No, Peter cut her off.
Then there must be something inside that.
Yes, you. Elizabeth's voice faltered.
Me?
Peter nodded. They'll tear this place apart to find me. If, however, I'm standing in the open, they won't search any further. You'll be safe. Oh? Matrix squeaked. You too, Peter added. Bess can chew her way out when I'm gone. Matrix protested. There's no time to argue, Peter barked, pulling the spider from his shoulder and tossing him through the opening.
You can't be...
Elizabeth began. There's no time to argue, Peter cut her off, seizing the mouse under her shoulders and shoving her in the hole. There was a loud scrape of wood against brick. Elizabeth pulled her tail in, just in time to avoid getting the tip crushed under the sofa's legs. In the dark, Elizabeth heard the sounds of many legs scuttling past, and the faint, high-pitched grunts of protest as Matrix rammed against the sofa repeatedly, but to no avail. Then Elizabeth heard the voices, and her heart nearly stopped. Peter, 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 I'm getting the feeling you're not so happy to see us. Can I punish him, Charlie? I'll be sure to take it slow. Elizabeth recognized Mickey's distinctive giggle. Next, a very unfamiliar voice spoke up, one that, Elizabeth reasoned, must have been this chubby Charlie she had been hearing about. Cool it, boys. This one goes to Mr. Big. Hear that, boyo? You're going to meet his high and mighty cheesiness. There was a short pause. Oh, what's that?
got nothing to say, and after you was so bloody talkative before.
Hey, that's enough.
There was another short silence. Elizabeth thought she could hear Bill growling for a moment, but it didn't last.
You coming easy, boyo, or do we have to get tough?
What do you expect me to do? Came Peter's sullen reply. Say I did outrun the two of you.
Hey!
Mickey protested quite loudly. Peter ignored him. I would still have to evade an entire city full of rats, all hunting for me. I see no alternative but to surrender. For a moment, Elizabeth heard chains rattling.
Oh, and up here I thought we'd have us a bit of fun.
The next voice carried the gravelly tone of Chubby Charlie.
Good. Then I won't have to rough you up too much.
Elizabeth gasped in the dark, clasping her hands over her mouth in horror as she heard the sounds of blows landing and a body falling.
Get 'em out of here, boys!
Peter cried out in pain. Bill laughed.
Sorry, chum. Wrong bleeding hand.
Chubby Charlie gave Bill a warning growl. There was a low thud, and then the sounds of heavy footfalls, retreating up the stairs and into the distance. Elizabeth's heart pounded as loud and heavy as any rat's footsteps in the ensuing silence. She took a deep breath, and creeping to the hole, peered out from under the sofa. She could still see 2 pairs of feet, 1 rat and 1 mouse.
Well, what a lovely, lovely light, and nobody here to enjoy it. Bloody shame to waste all that oil, eh?
Are you going to blow it out?
What, and waste this lovely light? Nah, I'm gonna have me some fun.
There was a sound of glass shattering, the crackle of fire, and a powerful scent of smoke reached Elizabeth's nose.
Oh, now will you look at that? All these nice things going up in smoke, eh?
It's very sad. So very sad.
I sure hope old Pete wasn't hiding anyone in here, 'cause they're about to get awful warm.
Too warm for a hot summer night,
Mickey giggled. Feet moved, strolling casually to the stairs, and vanished from sight.